Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded slowly over 4 years. A story of dreams and disillusionment, of love that turned complicated, and of a fatal night in Florida that left a family shattered. This is the story of Doug Benfield, a former Navy pilot who believed in second chances, and the woman he married after knowing her for only 13 days. Picture a warm summer evening in August of 2016 in Palm Beach, Florida. The presidential campaign was in full swing, and at a political gathering, two people met who seemed at first glance to have little in common. Doug Benfield was 54 years old, a widower, a former naval flight officer who had spent 3 years flying missions from San Diego before transitioning to work as a consultant for technology companies and defense contractors. He had a teenage daughter named Eva, who was 15 at the time. Just 9 months earlier, his wife Renee had died suddenly and unexpectedly from an undiagnosed heart condition. Eva had been the one to find her mother's body. The loss had devastated them both. Ashley Byers was 24 years old. She had trained as a ballerina with the Maryland Youth Ballet and had done some swimsuit modeling. That summer, she was working in the campaign office for Donald Trump in Sarasota, sometimes helping to energize crowds at rallies. She was graceful, beautiful, and full of ambitions for her future. She wanted to build something meaningful in the world of ballet. She wanted a family, she wanted love. When Doug and Ashley met at that gathering, something sparked between them immediately. Doug was captivated. Friends would later say he thought Ashley was the most beautiful, most amazing person he had ever met. For Ashley, Doug seemed loving, attentive, established. They both shared similar political views, a deep religious faith, and both even held concealed carry permits. There was, as one person observed, an instant connection over guns, God, and politics. 13 days later, they were married. The wedding took place in Charleston, South Carolina, Doug's hometown, at St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Very few people attended. Doug invited almost no one, not even his daughter Eva. One of Doug's closest friends, Trip Cormany, who happened to be an ordained Episcopal pastor, performed the ceremony. He wasn't entirely comfortable with the rushed decision, but he was loyal to his friend. Doug, deeply religious, wanted to marry Ashley before they became intimate. He believed in doing things the right way. For Eva, learning about the marriage was a shock. She was upstairs in their home when Doug called her down. She came downstairs to find her father and Ashley waiting to tell her something. Eva, still grieving her mother, tried to keep an open mind. She later recalled saying to her father that the only thing he would need to tell her about his relationship was if he had proposed. The moment those words left her mouth, Doug said, "We're married." It was a lot for a 15-year-old girl to process. Her mother had died less than a year before. Her father, who had been her rock through that devastating loss, had suddenly married a woman only 9 years older than Eva herself. But Eva wanted her father to be happy. If this kept him from being consumed by grief, she would try to accept it. Ashley moved into Doug's home in Mount Pleasant, just outside Charleston. She had a dream, a vision she had been carrying with her for years. She wanted to create a ballet company unlike any other, one that would celebrate diversity and inclusivity in an art form that had always been rigid about body types, heights, and appearances. She called it the American National Ballet. Doug, who friends joked couldn't spell ballet before he met Ashley, threw himself into making her dream a reality. When you love someone, you want to make them happy. Doug was determined to help Ashley build something extraordinary. Together, they began recruiting dancers from all over the country, promising them a revolutionary company that would welcome tall dancers, short dancers, dancers of different body types and ethnicities. It would be a home for those who had been told they didn't fit the traditional mold. But life at home was becoming complicated. Ashley tried to develop a motherly relationship with Eva, but Eva wasn't ready for that. She was still grieving her own mother, and the last thing she wanted was someone trying to replace her. Ashley meant well, perhaps, but the dynamic was awkward and painful. Eva felt like Ashley was taking away her best friend, her father, the one person who had promised her that everything would eventually be okay. The tension in the household grew, and then one day something happened that would foreshadow the darkness to come. During an argument about Eva, Doug lost his temper. He pulled out a gun, held it to his head, and threatened to blow his brains out in front of Ashley. Then he pulled the trigger. The bullet went into the ceiling of their kitchen. Doug's friend Trip Carmody would later recall Doug telling him about this incident. Doug was embarrassed, ashamed. He said it was the dumbest thing he had ever done in his life. And yet, despite this frightening display, Ashley didn't leave. 2 days later, Doug and Ashley held a formal wedding reception, as if nothing had happened. Ashley was also focused on another dream, becoming a mother. There was a problem, though. Doug had previously had a vasectomy, but because he loved Ashley and wanted to make her happy, he agreed to have the procedure reversed. For Eva, this felt like another betrayal. Her father had told her he wasn't planning on having more children. Now suddenly, he was starting over, building a new family. Eva felt like she was being replaced, just as her mother's memories seemed to be fading into the background. In the summer of 2017, Ashley became pregnant. Around the same time, approximately 40 dancers from around the world began arriving in Charleston to join the American National Ballet. They were excited, full of hope, ready to be part of something groundbreaking. They believed in Ashley's vision. They trusted that the promises they had been made would be kept. But when they arrived, Ashley was nowhere to be found. Doug stood before the assembled dancers and explained that Ashley was bedridden with a difficult pregnancy and wouldn't be able to work with them for the foreseeable future. The dancers were confused and disappointed. This wasn't what they had been promised. They had been told there would be a state-of-the-art facility in downtown Charleston. Instead, they found themselves asking local dance studios if they could use their space. The promised budget of $2.5 million never materialized. The grand vision began to crumble almost immediately. By the end of August, Ashley had moved back to Florida to live with her mother, Alicia. She said it was a mutual decision, that Doug couldn't take care of her while running the ballet company, and that her mother could provide better support during her difficult pregnancy. Doug stayed in Charleston, trying desperately to keep the American National Ballet alive. But without Ashley and without the promised funding, it was a losing battle. Within months, the company collapsed entirely, leaving dozens of professional dancers feeling betrayed and abandoned. The marriage, too, was beginning to show deep cracks. Ashley would later claim that during her pregnancy, she began to suspect Doug was poisoning her. She felt more nauseous than she thought she should be. She started asking Doug about how his first wife, Renee, had died. When Doug told her it was a heart condition, an artery blockage, Ashley began to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. She suggested to Doug's cousin Tommy that perhaps Doug had poisoned Renee. Tommy was stunned. He had read the autopsy report. It was clear. Renee had died of coronary artery sclerosis, a heart condition. There was no poison involved, but Ashley's suspicions deepened. One night in September, while Doug was out, Ashley and her mother returned to the house in Charleston. What happened that night would become another point of contention between them. Another piece of a story that was growing darker and more tangled with each passing month. In March of 2018, 3 weeks before her due date, Ashley checked into a hospital in Florida. She told the medical staff that her husband had been poisoning her. Doctors performed an emergency cesarean section and delivered a healthy baby girl. Doug didn't even know his daughter had been born. Ashley named the baby Emerson. She left Doug's name off the birth certificate. She had decided, it seemed, that she wanted to be a single mother. She wanted to raise her child alone, without Doug in their lives. When Doug found out, he was devastated. He sent emails, pleading to be part of his daughter's life. begging Ashley to let him be a father to Emerson. But Ashley was firm. She believed Doug was dangerous, manipulative, controlling. She believed he had harmed her during her pregnancy, and she was determined to protect her child. Doug hired attorneys. Ashley filed for domestic violence protection, submitting lengthy documents to the court outlining her allegations. She claimed Doug was abusive, that he had been controlling and violent throughout their marriage. She accused him of trying to poison her and of having poisoned his first wife. She sought a restraining order that would prevent Doug from having any contact with Emerson. But when the case went before a judge, the judge was not convinced. The judge found that there was not a single scintilla of credible evidence to support Ashley's claims of poisoning. The domestic violence injunction was denied. The judge questioned Ashley's credibility. Despite the court's ruling, Ashley continued to fight. Over the following months and years, Doug and Ashley would be in and out of family court, battling over custody. They obtained a mutual restraining order in South Carolina, one that prevented them from contacting each other. Doug eventually filed for divorce. He also filed allegations of parental alienation, claiming Ashley was deliberately trying to keep him away from his daughter. The custody arrangement that eventually emerged was complicated. Doug and Ashley would share custody of Emerson when she was 6 months old, though Ashley continued to accuse Doug of abuse. She later claimed that Emerson began coming home with injuries after spending time with Doug. She accused him of physically and sexually abusing their daughter. Child Protective Services investigated. Doug was evaluated by a psychologist. In the end, he was cleared of all allegations. No evidence was found to support Ashley's claims. And yet, the battle continued. Doug told friends and family that he believed Ashley might be mentally unstable. Ashley told her therapist and her mother that she was living in constant fear of Doug, that he was dangerous, that she had tried to get help from authorities but no one would believe her. By 2019, something unexpected happened. Doug and Ashley began to reconcile. After all the court battles, all the accusations, all the pain, they started spending time together again. They went to therapy together. They saw a psychologist as part of their custody proceedings. To outsiders, it seemed like they were trying to work things out, to rebuild their family for the sake of their daughter. You even noticed her father seemed happier. Doug told her that his relationship with Ashley was going well, that he was excited for a fresh start. Friends held their breath, hoping that maybe somehow this reunion would work. But they also worried. Trip Cormany, Doug's close friend, knew better than to try to talk Doug out of it. He could see that Doug was committed to making this work, no matter what it took. He would later say that Doug was going to do this if it killed him. In August of 2019, Doug noticed something. When Ashley came to drop off Emerson, she was wearing what appeared to be an engagement ring. Doug's suspicions were aroused. He hired a private investigator who discovered that Ashley was seeing someone else. Doug felt betrayed all over again. He filed for divorce once more. Ashley, in turn, filed new allegations. She claimed Doug had physically and sexually abused Emerson. Doug vehemently denied the accusations. Child Protective Services investigated again and found no evidence. Eva, Doug's older daughter, was interviewed. The investigation concluded that the allegations were unfounded. And then in the summer of 2020, another twist. Despite the divorce filing, despite the ongoing custody battle, despite everything, Ashley and Doug decided to try again. They made plans to move together to Maryland, where Ashley had grown up. They would live separately, in different homes, but they would both be there for Emerson. It was a plan that seemed to some optimistic. To others it seemed impossible. September 27th, 2020. It was a Sunday evening in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, a quiet suburban community where Ashley had been living with her mother, Alicia. Doug had come to help pack their belongings into a U-Haul truck for the move to Maryland. Emerson, now 2 years old, was at the house with her mother and grandmother. Around 7 p.m., Alicia took Emerson to a nearby park. This left Doug and Ashley alone in the house. What happened next is a matter of profound dispute. There were no witnesses. There was no video footage. There were only 2 people in that house, and only one of them would survive to tell the story. According to Ashley, an argument erupted between her and Doug. She would later testify in court that Doug became angry, that he struck her in the face, that he blocked her from leaving the room. She said she was terrified. that she grabbed her .45 caliber handgun, that she begged Doug to stop, to leave her alone. She claimed that Doug lunged at her, and in that moment, fearing for her life, she fired 2 shots. One hit Doug in the leg. The second, the fatal shot, entered the right side of his chest. The bullet traveled through his chest wall, hitting his right lung and causing catastrophic internal damage. Ashley ran, still holding the gun. She went to a neighbor's house. She told the neighbor that Doug had attacked her and that she had shot him in self-defense. The neighbor immediately called 911. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Doug still alive, but gravely injured. He was unable to speak. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the damage was too severe. Approximately 1 hour after being shot, Doug Benfield was pronounced dead. He was 58 years old. Detectives from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office began their investigation immediately. Ashley, advised by her attorney, did not speak to them. Her mother, Alicia, and her lawyer spoke on her behalf, stating that Ashley and Alicia had been living in fear of Doug for 3.5 years, that they had tried to get help but no one would listen. The investigators examined the scene carefully. They noted the trajectories of the bullets. They measured distances. They documented the evidence, and as they pieced together what had happened, they began to have doubts about Ashley's claim of self-defense. The medical examiner, Dr. Russell Vega, performed an autopsy on Doug's body. His findings were significant. The fatal shot had entered the right side of Doug's chest, not the front. If Doug had been lunging at Ashley, charging toward her, the wound would likely have been in the front of his body, but it wasn't. The bullet had entered from the side. Furthermore, there was no stippling on Doug's shirt. Stippling is a pattern of gunpowder residue that appears on a surface when a gun is fired at close range. The absence of stippling indicated that the gun had been fired from at least 3 to 7 feet away. This suggested that Doug and Ashley were not locked in close combat when the fatal shot was fired. They were not, as Ashley claimed, struggling in a life-or-death situation where Doug was lunging at her. The investigators also noted something else. When they arrived at the scene, they found multiple guns. Ashley had a concealed carry permit. Doug did too. Both of them were armed individuals who knew how to handle firearms. But the presence of these weapons and the circumstances of the shooting raised questions about what had really transpired that night. After a month of investigation, on November 4th, 2020, Ashley Benfield was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty. She posted a bond of $100,000 and was released from custody after 17 days in jail. For the next 4 years, the case would wind its way through the legal system, drawing national media attention and becoming known as the Black Swan case, a reference to the 2010 film about a tortured ballerina whose quest for perfection leads to mental instability. As the case developed, 2 starkly different narratives emerged. To the prosecution, this was a case about custody, about control, about a woman who had decided early in her pregnancy that she wanted to be a single mother and would stop at nothing to achieve that goal. Assistant State Attorney Suzanne O'Donnell argued that Ashley had fabricated the abuse allegations, that she had systematically worked to alienate Doug from his daughter, and that when all other avenues failed, when it became clear that Doug was not going to simply disappear from their lives, Ashley decided to eliminate him permanently. The prosecution pointed to the pattern of allegations over the years. Allegations that had been investigated and dismissed by judges, by child protective services, by psychologists. They pointed to the fact that Ashley had left Doug's name off Emerson's birth certificate, that she had repeatedly sought restraining orders, that she had accused Doug of poisoning her and his first wife, despite a complete lack of evidence. They argued that the night of the shooting, Doug and Ashley were packing for a move that would have involved shared custody, and that Ashley saw this as her last chance to gain sole control over her daughter. To the defense, this was a case about domestic violence, about a woman trapped in an abusive relationship with a man who was 30 years her senior, a man who was controlling, manipulative, and violent. Defense attorney Neil Taylor argued that Ashley had repeatedly sought help from authorities, that she had filed complaint after complaint, but that no one had believed her. He pointed to the incident where Doug fired a gun into the ceiling, to the turbulent nature of their relationship, to the power imbalance between them. Taylor presented text messages between Ashley and Doug, messages that he said showed Doug's controlling behavior. He brought in Ashley's therapist, who testified that Ashley had been living in a state of constant fear, that she believed her life was in danger. He argued that on the night of the shooting, Doug had attacked Ashley, that she had defended herself, and that she should be acquitted. Ashley herself took the stand. In emotional testimony, she described her relationship with Doug as confusing, a back and forth between moments of love and moments of fear. She said she had tried to make the marriage work because she didn't want to fail, because she believed that if she just loved Doug enough, things would change. She testified that on the night of September 27th, Doug had struck her, that he had blocked her from leaving, that she had grabbed her gun and begged him to stop. She said that when Doug lunged at her, she fired in self-defense. She was scared to death. She thought he was going to kill her. But the prosecution challenged her account. O'Donnell argued that the physical evidence contradicted Ashley's story. The side-to-side trajectory of the bullet, the distance from which the gun was fired, the lack of any significant injuries on Ashley's body beyond what O'Donnell called superficial scratches. O'Donnell argued that Ashley had shot Doug, not because she was in imminent danger, but because she had finally found a way to get what she wanted: sole custody of Emerson. Doug's family also spoke out. His daughter Eva, now in her early 20s, testified about her father's character. She said Doug was kind to a fault, smart, strong, generous. She said his generosity was what got him killed. Doug's brother David and his cousin Tommy also testified, describing Doug as a loving partner to Ashley, someone who had bent over backwards to try to make the relationship work. They rejected Ashley's characterization of Doug as abusive. They believed Ashley was the one who had been manipulating and controlling Doug, not the other way around. The trial began in late July of 2024 at the Manatee County Judicial Center in Bradenton, Florida. It lasted 6 days. Both sides presented their evidence, their witnesses, their theories of what had happened. The jury listened to testimony from Eva, from Doug's friends and family, from Ashley's therapist, from the medical examiner, from detectives and investigators. They saw photos of the scene. They heard recordings of the 911 call. They examined the text messages between Doug and Ashley. On the evening of July 30th, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Ashley Benfield was found not guilty of second-degree murder, but she was found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter with a firearm. When the verdict was announced, the judge immediately revoked Ashley's bond. She was taken into custody by the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Doug's family expressed relief that Ashley had been held accountable, though they were disappointed she hadn't been convicted of murder. Eva said she felt justice had been served. She believed her father was the victim, not Ashley. Ashley's supporters, including her mother Alicia and her young daughter Emerson, had been holding vigils outside the courthouse throughout the trial. They maintained that Ashley had acted in self-defense, that she had been a victim of abuse, and that the verdict was unjust. The case attracted significant attention on social media. Eva, who had a large following on TikTok, posted videos about the trial, sharing her perspective and her grief. Some people believed Ashley, others believed Doug's family. The case became in many ways a flashpoint for larger debates about domestic violence, about self-defense, about who gets believed and who doesn't. In December of 2024, Ashley returned to court for her sentencing hearing. She faced up to 30 years in prison for the manslaughter conviction. Both sides presented arguments about what an appropriate sentence would be. The defense asked for a downward departure from the minimum sentence. Ashley's attorney argued that she had acted under extreme duress, that she had shown remorse, that she had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that Doug had been the initiator and aggressor. The defense argued that Ashley's mental state and the circumstances of the relationship should be taken into account. The prosecution pushed for the maximum sentence. They argued that Ashley had not shown true remorse, that she had consistently portrayed herself as the victim when the evidence suggested otherwise, and that her actions had devastated Doug's family and left a young child without her father. Doug's family spoke. Eva addressed Ashley directly, asking the question that had haunted her for 4 years. Why? Doug's brother David said he forgave Ashley, but that she had caused him the greatest loss he had ever experienced. Tommy spoke about the pain the family had endured, about the daughter Doug would never see grow up. Judge Matthew White considered all the arguments. He acknowledged that both sides were viewing the case through very different lenses. He found that some but not all of the defense's arguments for a reduced sentence had been proven. He noted the complexity of the case, the conflicting accounts, the difficulty of determining the truth when there were no witnesses to the fatal encounter. In the end, Judge White sentenced Ashley Benfield to 20 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. Ashley has 30 days to appeal the sentence. As of now, she remains in custody, serving her time for the death of Doug Benfield. The story of Doug and Ashley Benfield raises profound questions that have no easy answers. Was this a case of domestic violence, where a woman finally fought back against an abuser who had tormented her for years? Or was it a case of manipulation and murder, where a woman systematically worked to eliminate the father of her child? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the complexity of their relationship. Relationships are rarely simple. People are capable of both love and harm. Doug Benfield was, by many accounts, a devoted father, a generous friend, a man who believed in second chances, and in the power of love to redeem difficult situations. He was also someone who, in a moment of anger, fired a gun into his own ceiling. He was someone whose friends worried about his judgment, about his refusal to walk away from a relationship that seemed to bring him nothing but pain. Ashley Benfield was a talented young woman, with dreams of building something meaningful in the world of ballet and in her rehearsal life. She was also someone whose allegations of abuse were repeatedly investigated and found to lack credible evidence. She was someone who, whether out of genuine fear or calculated manipulation, worked tirelessly to keep Doug away from his daughter. What happened on the night of September 27th, 2020, only two people know for certain, and one of them is no longer here to tell his side. The jury believed that Ashley's actions constituted manslaughter, not murder, suggesting they found her account at least partially credible, or that they had reasonable doubt about her intent. But they also found her guilty, indicating they did not fully believe her claim of self-defense. Eva Benfield is left to navigate life without her father, the man who had been her rock after her mother's death. Emerson is growing up without her father, too young to remember him, shaped by the conflicting narratives that surround his death. Alicia Byers has watched her daughter go to prison. Doug's family continues to grieve. The American National Ballet, that dream of an inclusive, revolutionary dance company, collapsed within months of its founding, leaving behind only disappointment and broken promises. Doug's hopes for a second marriage, for a new family, for happiness after the loss of his first wife, ended in tragedy. And so we close this story, not with neat resolution, but with the messy reality of human lives entangled in ways that led to an irreversible moment. A moment where, in a quiet house in Florida, two people faced each other, and one made a decision that ended a life and changed so many others forever. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I'm going to tell you a story. One that happened not so long ago in a quiet corner of Ohio. It's a story about a young woman named Shannon, about the darkness that can hide behind familiar faces, and about a sister's unrelenting search for truth. This is a story that needs to be told, not with sensationalism, but with the quiet respect it deserves. In the autumn of 2016, Youngstown, Ohio was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. It wasn't a large city, but it carried the weight of industrial decline and the struggles that came with it. The streets had seen better days. and by 2006, Youngstown had earned the unfortunate distinction of being ranked the ninth most dangerous city in America. But none of that mattered much to Shannon Elizabeth Graves. Shannon was born on November 4th, 1988, to Christine Graves and Ronnie DePaul. From the beginning, Shannon's life was marked by complexity. Her parents weren't together, and she grew up navigating the delicate balance of a blended family. She had a half-sister named Debbie, who was considerably older, and a younger brother named AJ, whom she adored with a fierce protectiveness that only siblings truly understand. Shannon was small in stature, barely reaching 5 feet tall, and weighing just under 100 pounds. But what she lacked in physical size, she made up for in personality. Her friends knew her by the nickname Star, and it suited her. She had long dark hair that cascaded past her shoulders, warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, and a smile that could light up even the darkest Ohio winter day. Those who knew Shannon described her as someone with a heart of gold. She was the kind of person who would drop everything to help a friend in need. She never went anywhere without her cell phone, always making sure she was reachable, always there when someone needed her. She loved animals, particularly her pit bull pup, Molly, who became her constant companion and confidant. In 2016, Shannon achieved something she was particularly proud of. She completed her training at Raphael's School of Beauty in Boardman and earned her cosmetology license. It represented a new beginning, a chance to build something stable in an often unstable life. Shannon was excited about starting a career in the beauty industry, about having something that was truly hers. But Shannon's life wasn't without its shadows. Like many young people in Youngstown, she found herself drawn to what some might call a rough crowd. She hung out with people who lived on society's edges, people who dealt in substances that existed outside the law, people whose lives were complicated and sometimes dangerous. Her half-sister Debbie, who had practically raised Shannon like a daughter, watched with concern as Shannon made choices that worried her. But Shannon was her own person, living her own life, making her own decisions. And in April of 2016, Shannon made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. She met a man named Arturo Novoa. Arturo Novoa was 31 years old when he entered Shannon's life. He was a small-time drug dealer, the kind of person who operated in the shadows of Youngstown's struggling neighborhoods, selling marijuana and other substances to make ends meet. He went by various names, sometimes calling himself Anthony Gonzalez, a detail that should have been a red flag from the start. But Shannon saw something in him. Perhaps it was the thrill of danger, or perhaps she believed she could be the one to change him. Whatever the reason, their relationship moved quickly. By September of 2016, just 5 months after they met, Shannon and Arturo moved in together in a home on Mahoning Avenue in Youngstown. From the outside, it might have looked like a fresh start, but behind closed doors, the relationship was anything but healthy. Those who knew Shannon during this time witnessed something that terrified them. Arturo was physically violent toward her. The relationship was tumultuous, marked by screaming arguments that neighbors could hear through thin walls, by bruises that Shannon tried to hide under long sleeves, by a pattern of abuse that grew worse with each passing week. Shannon's friends begged her to leave. Debbie pleaded with her to come home, to get away from this man who was hurting her. But like so many victims of domestic violence, Shannon found herself trapped in a cycle that's nearly impossible to break. There were probably promises that he would change, apologies that felt sincere in the moment, brief periods of calm that gave her hope things might get better. But they never did. By December of 2016, something shifted. Shannon and Arturo's relationship reached a breaking point, and he moved out of the Mahoning Avenue home. Shannon must have felt relief, perhaps even hope that she could finally move forward with her life, focus on her cosmetology career, spend time with Molly, rebuild. But Arturo hadn't really left her life. He had simply moved into another woman's life. Her name was Katrina Layton, a single mother who lived on Shields Road. Arturo had been seeing Katrina secretly, carrying on a relationship behind Shannon's back. When he moved out of Shannon's home, he moved directly into Katrina's. But here's where the story takes its first truly dark turn. After just 1 week with Katrina, Arturo moved back to Shannon's house on Mahoning Avenue. Why did Shannon take him back? We may never fully understand. Perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she was afraid of him. Perhaps she believed his promises that things would be different this time. Whatever the reason, Arturo Novoa was back in Shannon Graves' life, and he was still seeing Katrina Layton. February 24th, 2017 was a Friday. Winter still held Youngstown in its gray grip. It was the kind of day where darkness came early, where people hurried home from work wanting nothing more than to escape the cold. For Shannon Graves, it would be the last day of her life. What happened in that house on Mahoning Avenue has been pieced together through court testimony, forensic evidence, and the confessions of those involved. The details are disturbing, but they need to be told. At some point during that February day, an argument erupted between Shannon and Arturo. Perhaps she had discovered his continued relationship with Katrina. Perhaps it was about money, or drugs, or one of the countless other tensions that plagued their relationship. Whatever sparked it, the argument escalated. Arturo Novoa took a hammer. In the bedroom they once shared, in the home where Shannon should have felt safe, he struck her, again and again. Shannon Graves, 28 years old, bright and kind and full of dreams about her future in cosmetology, was beaten to death with a hammer by the man she had taken back into her life. But the horror didn't end with Shannon's death. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning. After killing Shannon, Arturo did what guilty people do. He panicked. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to call. Katrina Layton answered her phone that February evening. We can only imagine what Arturo told her, how he explained what he had done. But whatever he said, Katrina made a choice. Instead of calling the police, instead of seeking help for Shannon, Katrina chose to help Arturo cover up his crime. What followed was a grotesque attempt to hide what had happened. A series of actions so disturbing that the prosecutor who later handled the case would describe it as containing the most gruesome and horrific details in Mahoning County crime history. Arturo began by shaving Shannon's head, attempting to make identification more difficult. Then, together with Katrina, he wrapped Shannon's body in several black garbage bags. They placed her in the trunk of his car and drove through the dark Youngstown streets to Katrina Layton's home. On Shields Road, at Katrina's house, they were joined by another person, Andrew Herman, a friend of Arturo's who agreed to help with what came next. In Katrina Layton's garage, the three of them dismembered Shannon Graves' body. They cut off her arms. They cut off her legs. They removed her head. They placed the body parts in storage containers, transforming a young woman who had once dreamed of doing hair and makeup into unrecognizable pieces. But they weren't finished. Between February 24th and mid-March, Arturo, Katrina, and Andrew engaged in an elaborate and increasingly desperate attempt to destroy evidence of what they had done. Arturo had a friend who lived on Sherwood Avenue. On March 1st, just days after Shannon's murder, Arturo asked this friend if he could have a bonfire at his house. The friend, having no idea what Arturo was really planning, agreed. That evening, Arturo and Katrina brought bags and totes to the Sherwood Avenue address. In a growing fire, they burned Shannon's belongings. Her clothes, her papers, her identification, her long dark hair that Arturo had shaved from her head, a bracelet that said Shannon on it. The fire grew so large that neighbors became concerned. At one point, it was big enough that the fire department was called to investigate. Imagine firefighters arriving to put out what they thought was an out-of-control bonfire, having no idea they were actually looking at evidence of murder being destroyed in flames. The next day, the residents of the Sherwood Avenue house walked out to where the fire had been. They'd seen Arturo and Katrina pulling items from bags and totes and throwing them into the flames, and something about it had seemed strange. When they looked through the ashes, they found that bracelet, the one that said Shannon on it. Concerned, they scooped up the ashes from the fire pit and placed them in a laundry basket. They didn't know it yet, but they had just preserved crucial evidence. Meanwhile, back at the homes, Arturo and Katrina were dealing with Shannon's remains. On March 11th, they placed an order at Walmart for 12 gallons of sulfuric acid. But they were paranoid about being identified, so they placed the order under the name Chicken Man instead of using real names. When they went to pick up the acid, the Walmart employee refused to hand it over without seeing identification. It was store policy. So Katrina Layton showed her ID and used her own credit card to purchase 12 gallons of sulfuric acid. Think about that for a moment. A Walmart employee, probably working a minimum wage job, probably thinking about what to make for dinner that night, had no idea she was selling acid that would be used to dissolve parts of a murdered woman's body. Arturo and Katrina took the acid back to the Mahoning Avenue address. They poured it into the storage container holding Shannon's torso and head. The acid worked. After a fashion, it dissolved most of Shannon's torso and head. But not completely. Portions of her skull remained, along with some teeth. These remains, along with Shannon's arms and legs, were placed in a freezer in Shannon's own home. The same home where she had lived, where she had cared for Molly, where she had probably looked forward to starting her new career. And then something even more disturbing happened. Katrina Layton moved into Shannon's apartment. She slept in Shannon's bed. She used Shannon's phone. She spent money on Shannon's credit cards. She cared for Shannon's beloved dog, Molly. For the next several months, Katrina Layton essentially assumed Shannon Graves' identity, living her life as if Shannon had simply ceased to exist. Because in a way, that's exactly what Arturo and Katrina wanted everyone to believe. Shannon's family knew something was wrong. Shannon might go periods without constant contact, but she never completely disappeared. She had never missed her own birthday before. She had never missed Easter. By June 22nd, 2017, Shannon's half-sister Debbie DePaul had reached her limit. Something was deeply wrong. She contacted the Youngstown Police Department and filed a missing person report. Debbie told police it wasn't like Shannon to be completely unreachable for this long. She told them about Arturo, about the violent relationship, about her fears. But filing a missing person report was just the beginning of what would become an agonizing search for truth. Meanwhile, Arturo knew the walls were closing in. With Shannon now officially reported missing, police would start investigating. They would come to the Mahoning Avenue house. They would ask questions. The freezer containing Shannon's remains was a ticking time bomb. In mid-July, Arturo made a decision. He purchased a second freezer and transferred Shannon's remains into it. Then he needed somewhere to store this freezer, somewhere away from the Mahoning Avenue address where police might come looking. He reached out to an acquaintance, a man named Kenneth Eschenbaugh. Arturo told Kenneth a simple lie. His electricity had been cut off at home, and he needed a favor. Could he store a freezer in Kenneth's basement just temporarily until he could get his power back on? Kenneth Eschenbaugh and his wife lived in Campbell, small community adjacent to Youngstown. They were good people, the kind of neighbors who help when someone's in need. They agreed to let Arturo bring the freezer to their basement. The freezer arrived. It was locked, but that wasn't particularly unusual. Lots of people lock their freezers. The Eschenbaughs thought nothing of it. Days passed. Maybe a week. Then one evening, Kenneth's wife decided to make spaghetti for dinner. She needed ground meat, and she remembered the freezer in the basement. She knew it was Arturo's, but surely he wouldn't mind if she just borrowed a pound of ground beef. She could replace it later. She went down to the basement. She approached the locked freezer. It took some effort, but she managed to get it open. What she found inside wasn't ground beef. Wrapped in black garbage bags, frozen solid in the Campbell basement, were the dismembered remains of Shannon Elizabeth Graves. The discovery on that July evening sent shockwaves through the small communities of Campbell and Youngstown. Police were called immediately. The Mahoning County Sheriff's Department and Youngstown Police Department descended on the Eschenbaugh home. The freezer was removed as evidence. The remains inside were taken to the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office. Identification would require forensic analysis, dental records, and DNA testing. Within days, investigators confirmed what Shannon's family had feared but hoped against. The remains were those of Shannon Graves. Her fingerprints, taken from the portions of her hands that remained, matched her records. DNA confirmed her identity on July 29, 2017. Shannon was officially pronounced dead, even though she had actually died on February 24th, 5 months earlier. Arturo Novoa and Katrina Layton were arrested quickly. Both were charged with aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Bond was set at $1 million for each of them. Andrew Herman, who had helped dismember Shannon's body, was also arrested and charged. His girlfriend, Michelle Eilenfeld, was later arrested for lying to the grand jury and attempting to intimidate a witness who was cooperating with police. But the investigation was far from straightforward. Initially, Katrina Layton struck a deal. She would testify against Arturo in exchange for having her murder charges dropped. She pleaded guilty to lesser charges, abuse of a corpse and obstruction of justice. Shannon's family was outraged. Debbie DePaul and her father Ronnie felt betrayed by the justice system. They hadn't been notified of the plea negotiations. They hadn't been consulted about whether Katrina should be allowed to escape murder charges. According to Marzi's law, which guarantees certain rights to crime victims' families, they should have been informed of every step of the proceedings. But the prosecutors had made their decision. Katrina's testimony would be crucial in securing a conviction against Arturo Novoa. Except Katrina didn't hold up her end of the bargain. When prosecutors prepared for trial, they discovered that Katrina had lied to investigators. Her testimony was unreliable. The plea agreement had been based on false statements. Prosecutors filed a motion to vacate Katrina's plea and sentencing agreement. Instead of walking away with reduced charges, Katrina would face serious consequences after all. The case moved forward. Arturo Novoa, facing the weight of evidence against him and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, made a decision. He would accept a plea deal. In exchange for having the aggravated murder charge dismissed, Arturo pleaded guilty to murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, drug trafficking, possession of criminal tools, and multiple other charges. In total, he pleaded guilty to 43 offenses. On June 14th, 2019, Arturo Novoa stood before Judge Anthony Donofrio in Mahoning County Common Pleas Court for sentencing. The prosecutor, Attorney Stephanie Anderson from the Ohio Attorney General's office, addressed the court. She described the case as containing the most gruesome and horrific details in Mahoning County's history, possibly in all of Ohio's history. She detailed how Arturo had killed Shannon, dismembered her body, attempted to dissolve her in acid, burned her belongings, and moved her remains multiple times over months to avoid detection. Judge Donofrio listened to all the evidence. Then he looked at Arturo Novoa and spoke words that captured the horror of what had been done. Your planning, scheming, and actions in this case have shocked the conscience of the community, the judge said. Your actions were inhumane, cruel, sadistic, and barbaric. Arturo Novoa was sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. Given his age at sentencing, it meant he would likely die in prison. Katrina Layton, after her plea agreement fell apart, was ultimately sentenced to 18 years in prison for her role in the murder, dismemberment, and cover-up. She was later released to a correctional facility where she is expected to remain until 2036. Andrew Herman pleaded guilty to charges related to helping dismember Shannon's body and was sentenced to prison time. Michelle Einfeld was sentenced for her obstruction efforts. But even with all these convictions, something crucial remained unresolved. Not all of Shannon's remains had been found. Her complete body had never been recovered. Portions of her had been dissolved in acid. Other portions may have been disposed of in ways police never discovered. To this day, investigators continue to search for additional remains, hoping to give Shannon's family complete closure. Every few weeks, Debbie DePaul visits St. John's Cemetery in Campbell. She trims the grass around Shannon's grave. She spray paints a large pink heart on the ground next to the gravestone. Pink was Shannon's favorite color. Shannon Elizabeth Graves is buried there, or at least the parts of her that were recovered. The gravestone marks a life that ended far too soon, a life full of potential that was stolen by violence. Debbie took in Shannon's pit bull, Molly. The dog serves as a living connection to the sister Debbie loved and lost. Every time she looks at Molly, she remembers the Shannon who cared for this animal, who loved with her whole heart, who dreamed of building a career and a better life. The case highlights something that often goes unnoticed in true crime stories. Shannon Graves was a real person. She wasn't just a victim in a sensational case. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She had dreams and fears and favorite colors. She wanted to do hair and makeup. She loved her dog. She was trying to navigate a complicated life in a complicated world, and she found herself in a relationship with a violent man. Situation that escalates to lethality far more often than most people realize. Domestic violence claims lives with devastating regularity. The statistics are chilling. 1 in 4 women will experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Shannon's story is a reminder that abuse doesn't always look the way we expect. The victims don't always leave. The perpetrators don't always seem dangerous to outsiders, and the consequences can be fatal. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. If you or someone you know is in a potentially dangerous relationship, help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. In the Youngstown area, organizations like Sojourner House provide shelter and support. These resources exist because of cases like Shannon's. Because people like Debbie DePaul refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. And so we come to the end of Shannon's story, or at least the end of what can be told. Her murder shocked a community. Her case worked its way through the criminal justice system. Her killers were convicted and sent to prison. But Shannon herself remains more than just a case file. She's a sister who is missed, a daughter who is mourned, a young woman whose life mattered, whose dreams mattered, whose favorite color was pink. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think of Shannon. Perhaps you'll remember that behind every true crime story is a real person, someone who laughed and loved and hoped for better days. And in the morning, maybe take a moment to appreciate the people in your life, to recognize the signs if someone you know is in danger, to remember Shannon Graves and the countless others whose stories need to be told. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we'll explore a tale of love, ambition, betrayal, and the slow, insidious nature of evil hidden behind a perfect facade. There are some stories that haunt us not because they're loud or sudden, but because they unfold like poison seeping slowly through the cracks of what seems perfect. The murder of Eric Miller is one such story. It takes place in the year 2000, in a city known for research and innovation, where brilliant minds gather to solve the world's most pressing problems. This is a story about a young man who dedicated his life to finding cures for dying children, a story about a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, and a story about how sometimes the people we trust most are capable of unimaginable cruelty. So relax your shoulders and let me take you back to Raleigh, North Carolina, where autumn leaves were falling, and where life was quietly, methodically being stolen away. Eric Dwayne Miller was born on April 3rd, 1970 in Newcastle, Indiana. He grew up in Cambridge City, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and where a boy with a bright smile and an even brighter mind could make his mark early. From his earliest days, Eric stood out. In high school, he served as class vice president for 4 consecutive years. He played tennis with dedication and precision. He was a member of the National Honor Society. Teachers would later remember him as unfailingly polite, endlessly curious, and possessed of a kindness that seemed almost old-fashioned in its sincerity. When it came time for college, Eric chose Purdue University. There in the laboratories and lecture halls, he found his calling in biochemistry. The microscopic world of cells and molecules fascinated him. He was methodical, patient, and driven by a desire to make a real difference in the world. It was in a science class at Purdue that Eric met Ann Breyer. She was tall, blonde, intelligent, and ambitious. Friends and family would later describe the couple as looking like Ken and Barbie, the all-American dream. Eric's sister, Leanne, could tell immediately that this relationship was different from Eric's previous romances. There was something in the way he looked at Anne, something deeper. Anne's college roommate, Renee, remembered the Valentine's Day when Eric proposed. It was, she said, the happiest time of Anne's life. She was marrying the man of her dreams. On February 27th, 1993, Eric and Anne were married. He was 22. She was 22. They had their whole lives ahead of them, or so it seemed. After graduating from Purdue in 1992 with his undergraduate degree, Eric continued his education. He was accepted into the doctoral program in biochemistry at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. The couple moved south, leaving behind the familiar landscapes of Indiana for the tree-lined streets of North Carolina's Research Triangle. Anne found work as a research scientist at GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. She was surrounded by state-of-the-art laboratories, brilliant colleagues, and the promise of a lucrative career. Eric, meanwhile, pursued his doctorate with single-minded devotion. In December of 1998, at the age of 28, he earned his PhD in biochemistry. But instead of accepting the high-paying positions that pharmaceutical companies dangled before him, positions that would have brought six-figure salaries and comfortable suburban lives, Eric made a different choice. He accepted a postdoctoral fellowship at the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His focus was pediatric AIDS research. He was working to save the lives of children born with HIV, children who had no control over their diagnosis, children who deserved a fighting chance. It wasn't glamorous work, it wasn't lucrative, but it was meaningful, and for Eric Miller, that was worth more than money. The couple bought a house in Raleigh. Eric was over the moon when their daughter Claire was born. He told his mother Doris something she would never forget. Looking at his infant daughter, he said, "Mom, you always told me how much you loved me, but I never knew how much you loved me until I had Claire." Eric was an active member of St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church in Raleigh. He served as a coordinator for the Eucharistic ministry. He and Anne even volunteered as marriage counselors at their church, helping other couples navigate the challenges of married life. To everyone who knew them, Eric and Anne Miller were living proof that hard work, faith, and love could build a beautiful life. They were the couple everyone admired, the couple everyone wanted to be, but behind closed doors, cracks were forming in the foundation. Cracks that no one could see. Cracks that would soon split wide open. Anne Miller had always wanted more, while Eric was content with his modest salary and his meaningful work. Anne craved a certain lifestyle. She wanted nice things, she wanted adventure, she wanted excitement. At GlaxoSmithKline, Anne worked alongside hundreds of scientists and researchers. Among them was a man named Darrell Willard. He was 37 years old, married to a woman named Yvette, and by all accounts he was good at his job. Respected, reliable, but Darrell Willard was going through what many would call a midlife crisis. As he approached 40, he found himself taking stock of his life, questioning his choices, wondering if this was all there was. He was vulnerable. And Anne Miller, it seems, recognized that vulnerability. No one knows exactly when the affair between Anne Miller and Darrell Willard began, but phone records would later paint a damning picture. During a one-month period in the fall of 2000, there were more than 100 calls between Anne's home, work, and cell phones, and Darrell's various phone lines. 51 calls from Anne's phones to Darrell's cell phone, 29 calls from Darrell's phones to Anne's cell, 22 calls to his work phone, 6 calls to his home phone. The calls came at all hours, early morning, late at night during the workday when they could have simply walked to each other's desks. There were also emails, dozens of them, recovered later from Anne's work computer. The emails began in late October of 2000 and continued until mid-November. They were, according to police reports, clearly indicative of a personal relationship, the kind that goes far beyond professional courtesy. Darrell's wife, Yvette, began to suspect something was wrong. She noticed the way Darrell talked about Anne. It was different from the way he talked about anyone else at work. There was an edge to it, an intensity. Just days before Eric Miller became violently ill, Anne and Darrell took a romantic trip together to Chicago. While Eric was at home, presumably caring for their infant daughter or working in his laboratory, trying to save children's lives, his wife was in another state with another man. But the affair, destructive as it was not the worst of what Anne Miller was hiding. She had been unfaithful before Darrell Willard ever entered the picture. Lieutenant Chris Morgan, the detective who would later lead the investigation into Eric's death, discovered that Anne had been involved with a man in California. She had paid for cross-country flights to meet him. She had arranged rendezvous at lavish hotels in New York and on the Outer Banks. She spent money they didn't have to maintain a secret life that Eric knew nothing about. Anne Miller, it seemed, was living a double life. Triple if you counted the facade she maintained at church, where she and Eric counseled other couples on how to maintain healthy marriages. The question that would haunt investigators for years was simple but terrible. When did Anne Miller decide that an affair wasn't enough? When did she decide that the only way to have the life she wanted was to end the life of the man who loved her? November 15th, 2000, started like any other Wednesday evening. Eric Miller met his wife and some of her colleagues for an evening of bowling at a local alley in Raleigh. It was meant to be a casual, fun night out. a chance to unwind after a long day of work. Among the group was Daryl Willard. Eric had no reason to be suspicious. As far as he knew, Daryl was simply one of Ann's coworkers. Just another scientist from the pharmaceutical company. Someone to make small talk with while they bowled. At some point during the evening, Daryl poured Eric a beer. It was a simple gesture, friendly, normal. Eric took the beer and drank it, but according to what Daryl would later confess to his attorney, that beer contained something else. Something invisible. Something tasteless, or nearly so. Eric complained that the beer tasted bitter, but he drank it anyway. Arsenic. Approximately 30 minutes after Eric arrived at the bowling alley, he became violently ill. The symptoms came on suddenly, and with brutal force. Severe nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. He looked everyone present like a man suffering from the worst food poisoning imaginable. Ian rushed him to Rex Hospital in Raleigh. The emergency room doctors examined him, ran tests, and concluded that he was suffering from a severe gastrointestinal illness, perhaps food poisoning, perhaps a stomach virus. These things happened. They gave him fluids, medication for the nausea, and monitored him carefully. Eric spent more than a week in the hospital. Slowly his symptoms improved. The vomiting stopped. His color returned. Whatever had made him so terribly sick seemed to be leaving his system. The doctors, satisfied that he was on the mend, released him to go home. But what the doctors didn't know, what they had no reason to test for, was that Eric Miller had been poisoned with arsenic, and the person who poisoned him was about to do it again. Arsenic is an element, a metalloid that exists naturally in the Earth's crust. For centuries, it was known as the king of poisons and the poison of kings. It was favored by murderers because it was difficult to detect, because its symptoms mimicked common illnesses, and because death from arsenic poisoning could easily be attributed to natural causes. In small doses, arsenic causes gastrointestinal distress, weakness, confusion. In larger doses, it attacks the organs, causes seizures, coma, and death. The truly insidious thing about arsenic is that it can be administered over time, allowing the poisoner to watch their victims slowly deteriorate while maintaining plausible deniability. At GlaxoSmithKline, both Ann Miller and Daryl Willard had access to arsenic compounds. The chemical was used in their laboratories for research purposes. No one would think twice about seeing either of them handle it. It was part of their job. Eric returned home from the hospital, weak but grateful to be alive. He resumed his work at the cancer center. He held his daughter. He tried to rebuild his strength. He had no idea that the person sleeping beside him every night, the person he trusted more than anyone in the world, was planning his death. 6 days after he was released from the hospital, on November 30th, 2000, Eric was eating dinner at home with Ann when he became violently ill again. The symptoms were identical to before. Severe vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness so profound he could barely stand. Ann called an ambulance. Eric was rushed back to Rex Hospital, then transferred to UNC hospitals for more intensive care. This time, the doctors were baffled. Young, healthy men didn't just collapse like this twice in 2 weeks. Something was deeply wrong. Blood tests were ordered. Extensive blood tests. And then hours before Eric Miller died, doctors made a shocking discovery. Eric's blood contained high levels of arsenic. This wasn't food poisoning. This wasn't a virus. This was poison. But by the time the doctors discovered what was killing Eric Miller, it was too late to save him. On December 2nd, 2000, at the age of 30, Eric Miller died of cardiac arrest brought on by arsenic poisoning. His heart, weakened by the toxic assault on his system, simply stopped beating. His parents, Veris and Doris, arrived at the hospital just minutes after their son's death. Doris would later describe the scene with heartbreaking clarity. Eric was lying in his hospital bed with a breathing tube still in his mouth. They had tried to resuscitate him, but there was nothing more to be done. His body was cold. Doris wanted to remove the tube from his mouth. She wanted to cover him up because he looked so cold. A mother's instinct, even in death, is to protect her child. At the funeral, Ann Miller appeared devastated. She wept. She leaned on her father for support. She appeared to everyone present to be a young widow shattered by the sudden, inexplicable loss of her husband. Eric's family was in shock. This made no sense. Eric was 30 years old. He was healthy. He was a brilliant researcher. How could he just die? But even as the family grieved, the Raleigh Police Department launched an investigation. Arsenic poisoning is not accidental. Someone had killed Eric Miller. The question was who? Lieutenant Chris Morgan was assigned to lead the case. He was a veteran homicide investigator, approaching retirement age, and the Eric Miller case would become an obsession that would define the final years of his career. Morgan's first thought was that perhaps Eric had been poisoned accidentally at his laboratory. Raleigh was known as the research capital of the nation, home to more than 100 laboratories. Perhaps there had been contamination, an accident. But when police examined Eric's workplace at the Lineberger Cancer Center, they found no arsenic. None. His laboratory was clean. Then the autopsy report came back, and it revealed something even more shocking than the arsenic poisoning itself. The medical examiner, Dr. Tom Clark, found arsenic in samples of Eric's hair, and not recent arsenic. The hair samples showed that Eric had been exposed to arsenic 4 months before that night at the bowling alley. 4 months before he ever went bowling with Daryl Willard. Months before anyone believed Ann and Daryl's affair had even begun. Dr. Clark was almost certain that Eric had received multiple doses of arsenic over a period of months, and the final fatal dose had likely been administered while Eric was in the hospital during his second admission.
Let that sink in for a moment.
Someone had walked into Eric Miller's hospital room while he lay weak and vulnerable, while nurses bustled in the hallway, while family members sat in waiting rooms praying for his recovery, and they had given him a lethal dose of poison. As Lieutenant Morgan pieced together the timeline, one terrifying truth became clear. Arsenic is not the kind of poison you can administer from a distance. The poisoner has to be close to the victim. Close enough to put the arsenic in food or drink. Close enough to inject it into an IV line. Close enough to watch them die. In terms of possible suspects, that left only one person. Ann Miller. Detective Deborah Regenton was sent to search the Miller home. She and her team collected samples of everything. Every bottle of shampoo, every conditioner, every bar of soap, every fluid in the refrigerator, every cleaning product under the sink. If it was liquid, if it could conceivably contain arsenic, they took a sample. They found nothing. But phone records and computer forensics were beginning to tell a very different story. The affair between Ann and Daryl Willard was now obvious. More than 100 phone calls in a single month. Emails that clearly showed a romantic relationship. A trip to Chicago just days before Eric became ill. On January 21st, 2001, the police made their move. They went to Ann's house on Claire's first birthday. They wanted to confront her about the affair. They wanted answers. Lieutenant Morgan knocked on the door. Ann's father answered, and Ann appeared behind him. She looked, according to Morgan, very weak. Her father was holding her up. She appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Morgan looked at her, and in that moment, he later said he saw pure evil. It wasn't something he could explain rationally. It was instinct. Years of looking into the eyes of killers had taught him to recognize it. And he recognized it in Ann Miller. But having a gut feeling and having evidence are two very different things. Morgan needed proof. He needed something concrete that would tie Ann to her husband's murder. The same day police confronted Ann, they also went to Daryl Willard's home to question him. Daryl had been avoiding police. He hadn't returned calls. He hadn't given an interview. When Morgan arrived at his house, Daryl came to the door, and Morgan saw a man experiencing what he could only describe as total defeat. Morgan said to Daryl, "I think you've been used by a woman." Daryl looked up with resignation on his face and replied, "Yeah, and she's done a very good job of it." Then Daryl said he couldn't talk anymore. He needed to call his attorney. He sat in the back of Morgan's police car and made the call while Morgan stood outside, wishing desperately that he could hear the conversation. He was certain Daryl knew who killed Eric Miller. He was the key to solving the case. But 24 hours later, everything changed. On January 22nd, 2001, Yvette Willard returned home to find her husband's lifeless body in the garage. Daryl had taken his own life. Beside his body was a note. In it, he apologized to his family for leaving them, but he also denied involvement in Eric Miller's murder. He wrote, "I have been accused of an action for which I am not responsible. I have taken no one's life save my own." Yvette knew about the affair. She and Daryl had talked about it constantly. He had been upfront with her about his involvement with Anne, or so she believed. But Yvette insisted that Daryl was not a killer. He had told her directly that he did not kill Eric, that he did not know who killed Eric. The morning of his death, Daryl had been scheduled to meet with his attorney, Richard Gammon. The police had searched his home the day before, looking for arsenic, stories about his affair with Anne, about the romantic trip to Chicago, about his presence at the bowling alley the night Eric first became ill. All of it was about to hit the news. His reputation, which he had worked a lifetime to build, was going to be destroyed. For whatever reason, guilt, shame, fear, or a combination of all three, Daryl Willard chose to end his life rather than face what was coming. His death devastated his wife and left investigators in a terrible position. If Daryl had information about Anne's involvement in the murder, that information died with him, or did. Before Daryl killed himself, he had called his attorney, Richard Gammon, and according to attorney-client privilege, whatever Daryl told Gammon in that conversation was protected. Gammon could not reveal what his client had said without violating one of the most sacred principles of the legal profession. But Lieutenant Morgan believed that conversation held the key to everything. He believed Daryl had confessed to Gammon, had told him exactly what Anne had done, and Morgan was determined to find a way to access that information, even if it meant going all the way to the state's highest court. Eric's body had been cremated at Anne's insistence, despite his parents' wishes to bury him in Indiana. In retrospect, that decision seemed calculated. Cremation destroys evidence. It makes further forensic analysis impossible. Anne hired two of North Carolina's top criminal defense attorneys and refused to speak with police or with Eric's family. The case went cold. Months passed, then years. The investigation into Eric Miller's death became something of a waiting game. Without Daryl Willard's testimony, without a confession from Anne, Lieutenant Morgan was stuck. He had phone records showing an affair. He had evidence of arsenic in Eric's system. He had a timeline that showed Eric had been poisoned over a period of months. But he didn't have the one thing he needed most: proof that Anne Miller had administered the poison. The North Carolina legal system became embroiled in a precedent-setting debate over attorney-client privilege. Could a dead man's attorney be forced to reveal what that man had told him in confidence? Under what circumstances, if any, did the public's interest in solving a murder outweigh an individual's right to confidential legal counsel? Yvette Willard, Daryl's widow, took an unusual position. She wanted attorney Richard Gammon to reveal what her husband had told him. She believed it was the only way Daryl could speak up on his own behalf. The only way to clear his name if he was innocent, or to reveal the truth if he wasn't. The case wound its way through the courts. Lower courts heard arguments. Appeals were filed. Legal scholars debated the implications. If attorney-client privilege could be breached in this case, what did that mean for the entire legal system? Meanwhile, Anne Miller moved on with her life in a way that seemed shocking to those who had known Eric. In November of 2003, just 3 years after Eric's death, Anne married Paul Martin Kantz, a Christian rock guitarist she had met in Wilmington, where she had moved with her daughter Claire. Anne Miller was now Anne Miller Kantz. She had a new life, a new husband, a new identity, and Lieutenant Chris Morgan, approaching retirement, seemed no closer to bringing her to justice than he had been the day Eric died. But Morgan never gave up. The case, he said, had gotten under his skin. It caused him sleepless nights. Other detectives might have moved on, might have accepted that some cases go unsolved, but not Chris Morgan. He was obsessed with getting justice for Eric Miller. And then in the spring of 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court made a landmark ruling. In a decision that stunned legal experts across the state, the court ruled that attorney Richard Gammon must reveal what Daryl Willard had told him about Anne Miller's role in Eric Miller's murder. The court found that the need for justice in a murder case outweighed the usual protections of attorney-client privilege, especially when the client was deceased and could not assert the privilege himself. Gammon, who had fought against revealing the information, was now compelled by the highest court in the state to disclose what he knew, and what he revealed changed everything. Attorney Richard Gammon testified that Daryl Willard had told him about a conversation in a parking lot. Anne Miller had been crying. She was distraught, and she had admitted something terrible to Daryl. According to Gammon, Daryl said that Anne confessed to going to the hospital while Eric was admitted during his second illness. She had taken a syringe containing a substance, presumably arsenic, and injected it into Eric's IV line while he lay helpless in his hospital bed. When Daryl asked Anne why she had done it, her response was chilling in its emptiness. She said, I don't know why I did it. No elaborate explanation, no justification, just a blank admission that she had murdered her husband and didn't really understand her own motivations. Gammon's testimony also revealed that Daryl had admitted to spiking Eric's beer with arsenic at the bowling alley. On November 15th, at Anne's urging, the plan had been for that dose to be fatal. But Eric survived, so Anne decided she would have to finish what she and Daryl had started. She would have to kill Eric herself, and she did. In his hospital room, while nurses walked the hallways, while Eric's parents waited for news, while doctors tried to save his life, Ann Miller walked in and poisoned her husband one final time. With this information, prosecutors finally had what they needed. In September of 2004, nearly 4 years after Eric Miller's death, Ann Miller Kantz was charged with first-degree murder. Ann Miller Kantz's trial was scheduled for early 2005, but as the prosecution prepared its case, as the evidence mounted, as the walls closed in, Ann's defense attorneys began negotiations for a plea deal. On November 8, 2005, Ann appeared in a Wake County courtroom wearing a cream turtleneck, a cropped black blazer, and a gray skirt. Her head was bowed. Tears streamed down her face. Through her attorney, Joseph Cheshire, Ann Miller Kantz pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She acknowledged that she had conspired with Daryl Willard and that she had poisoned Eric at least twice before his death in December of 2000. Her attorney read a statement on her behalf, saying she felt a deep sense of remorse and regret for Eric Miller's death. Under the plea deal, Ann was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms totaling 25 to 31.5 years in prison. It was the maximum sentence allowed for someone with no prior criminal convictions. She would be at least 60 years old before she would be eligible for release. But Ann never spoke on her own behalf. She never looked at Eric's family members as they gave their victim impact statements. She kept her head down and cried quietly. Eric's family was finally able to address her directly, to say the things they had been holding inside for 5 long years. One of Eric's sisters asked, Ann, why don't you look at me? Why can't you look at me? Eric's mother, Doris, her voice breaking, said, I have a hole in my heart and a pain in my chest every day. And with every breath I take, you have taken my son from me. I'll never hold him again. He'll never sit at my table. I will never see him smile. Another sister, Leanne Nagy, spoke about Claire, who was now 5 years old and living with one of Ann's sisters. Leanne said, I don't believe that you, Ann, truly love your daughter. How could you? You have taken away one of the most precious gifts that she will ever have. Her father. I will never understand, Ann, why you just didn't divorce him. You will get your just punishment and death, with eternity in hell. When the victim impact statements were finished, Ann Miller Kantz turned around and flashed a smile at her second husband, Paul Kantz, who was sitting in the courtroom. That smile would haunt everyone who saw it, in a moment when she should have been devastated by the weight of her crimes, by the pain she had inflicted on an innocent man and his family. Ann Miller Kantz smiled. Lieutenant Chris Morgan, who had spent 4 years of his life pursuing justice for Eric Miller, spoke to reporters after the sentencing. He said Ann had done these things and walked away without any remorse. He called her behavior cold and calculated. He said she was a psychopath. Eric's father, Verus, compared Ann to Scott Peterson, the California man who had murdered his pregnant wife. I feel like she's a narcissistic psychopath in the mold of Scott Peterson, Verus said. Ann Miller Kantz was taken to the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh, where she would spend the next several decades of her life. Even with Ann's guilty plea, questions lingered. Questions that would never be fully answered. Why did Ann Miller decide to kill her husband rather than simply divorce him? North Carolina is a no-fault divorce state. She could have walked away. She could have started a new life without committing murder. Some speculated that money played a role. Eric had life insurance. Perhaps Ann wanted the payout without the stigma and financial complications of divorce. Others believed Ann simply wanted to eliminate Eric because he was an obstacle to the life she wanted to live. A life of affairs, of freedom. of doing whatever she pleased without the moral constraints that Eric represented. Lieutenant Morgan, who had looked into Anne's eyes that day at her house, believed she was fundamentally broken, a person without a conscience, someone capable of extraordinary cruelty without experiencing normal human emotions like guilt or empathy. But Anne herself, even in her guilty plea, offered no clear explanation. "I don't know why I did it," she had told Darrell Willard. It was the closest thing to an answer anyone would ever get. The case also raised questions about Darrell Willard's level of involvement and culpability. He had spiked Eric's beer with arsenic. He had engaged in an affair with a married woman. He had been manipulated by Anne, according to his own admission. But did he know Anne would finish what they started? Did he know she would go to the hospital and inject poison into Eric's IV? Yvette Willard insisted until the end that her husband didn't kill anyone, that he was a good man who made terrible mistakes. That Ann Miller had used him, manipulated him, and ultimately driven him to suicide. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complex middle ground of human nature and moral culpability. And what of Claire Miller, the daughter who would grow up without her father? She was barely a year old when Eric died. She would have no memories of him, no memories of the man who held her with such love and wonder, no memories of the father who told his mother that having a daughter had taught him the depth of a parent's love. Claire's childhood would be marked by the knowledge that her mother had murdered her father, that Ann Miller had robbed her of the one person who would have loved her unconditionally, who would have supported her dreams, who would have been there for every milestone and every moment. It is a tragedy within a tragedy. The murder of Eric Miller stands as a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it goes bowling with you. Sometimes it sleeps beside you at night and whispers that it loves you. Eric Miller dedicated his short life to helping others, to finding cures for children born with a disease they didn't choose, to making the world a better place through patience, intelligence, and compassion. He was a son who made his parents proud, a brother who was loved by his siblings, a friend who was remembered with fondness, a husband who, until the very end, believed in the goodness of the woman he married, and a father who never got to see his daughter grow up. His murder was not quick. It was not merciful. It was slow, calculated, and cruel. Ann Miller poisoned him over a period of months, watching him suffer, rushing him to hospitals, playing the concerned wife while she was the one causing his agony. And when arsenic in his food and drink didn't kill him quickly enough, she walked into his hospital room and finished the job herself. Justice, such as it was, came eventually, but no prison sentence could return Eric Miller to his family. No guilty plea could erase the pain his parents felt every time they thought of their son dying in that hospital bed. No courtroom drama could give Claire her father back. In the end, the case of Eric Miller is a story about the dark side of human nature, about the capacity for betrayal, about the price of trust misplaced, and about the slow, patient work of one detective who refused to let a killer go free. Lieutenant Chris Morgan said the case gave him sleepless nights, that it got under his skin, that he couldn't let it go even as he approached retirement. For 4 years, he pursued justice for a man he never met, a man whose only crime was loving the wrong person. And in the end, Morgan succeeded. Ann Miller Cons went to prison. The truth came out. Justice delayed but not denied was served, but Eric Miller is still dead. His daughter still grew up without him, and somewhere in North Carolina, his parents still feel the absence of their son every single day. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the summer of 2018, James and Michelle Butler made a decision that many people only dream about. They decided to rent out their home in Romney, New Hampshire, pack up their lives into a recreational vehicle, and travel across America. James was 48 years old. He had spent 21 years serving in the United States Navy as an air traffic controller aboard the USS Enterprise. one of the most famous aircraft carriers in American history. He had raised 2 children in Virginia, where the massive naval base at Norfolk had been his home port for years. After retiring from the Navy in 2010, James had returned to New Hampshire to spend time with his aging mother. It was during those years at a local darts tournament that he met Michelle. Michelle was 46, warm and adventurous, with a spirit that matched James's own. They married in May of 2015, and by all accounts, they were inseparable. After James's mother passed away, the couple worked various jobs. James built homes and managed a local Walmart, but something was calling to them. Something bigger than the routine of everyday life. So they made their choice. They would become full-time travelers. They rented out their Rumney home and purchased a recreational vehicle. At first, they took seasonal jobs at oil rigs in the Southwest, working in Arizona and other remote locations. The work was hard, but it funded their adventures. Between jobs, they explored the country, sharing their journey on Facebook with family and friends back home. Photos of desert sunsets, mountain vistas, open roads stretching to the horizon. Their loved ones followed along with joy and perhaps a touch of envy. James's sister, Deborah Van Loon, later recalled how the couple would drive up to an hour just to find cell phone service so they could video call with Michelle's young granddaughter. They spoke to family every few days, keeping everyone updated on their travels. Someone in their extended family was in touch with them nearly every single day. This wasn't reckless wandering. This was a carefully maintained connection to the people who loved them, even as they explored the edges of the American landscape. By the autumn of 2019, James and Michelle had finished their most recent work assignment and were heading east. Their next destination was Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they had secured jobs selling Christmas trees for the holiday season. It was mid-October, and they were making their way along the Gulf Coast of Texas. On October 15th, 2019, Michelle posted on Facebook that they had arrived at Padre Island near Corpus Christi, Texas. It was a beautiful stretch of beach, miles of sand and seagrass, with the Gulf of Mexico stretching out in endless blue-green waters. They parked their truck and travel trailer in an area known locally as the Bowl, a popular camping spot for travelers and beach lovers. The air was warm. The sound of the waves was constant and soothing. The next day, October 16th, Michelle sent a text message to a friend. It was 1:13 in the afternoon Eastern Time. That was the last anyone would hear from them. When you're close to someone, you develop rhythms, patterns of communication that become as natural as breathing. For the Butler family, those patterns were sacred. Regular phone calls, video chats with grandchildren, updates about where they were and where they were going next. So when the calls stopped, the family noticed immediately. Days passed. October 17th, October 18th, October 19th. No word from James or Michelle. Their phones went to voicemail. Their social media went silent. For a couple who had been so diligent about staying in touch, this silence was deafening. On October 23rd, after missing a scheduled call, the family filed a missing persons report with authorities in Texas. The Clearburg County Sheriff's Office began their investigation. They knew James and Michelle had last been seen on Padre Island. Their truck, a 2018 silver Chevrolet 2500 pickup, and their white Cedar Creek travel trailer were also missing. Deputies began searching the area, checking with local businesses, reviewing surveillance footage. What they found was troubling. On October 21st, surveillance cameras at the United States-Mexico border had captured an image of the Butler's truck and trailer crossing into Mexico. But the man driving wasn't James Butler. The figure at the wheel was someone else entirely. The investigation intensified. On October 27th, 4 days after the missing persons report was filed, a Clearburg County deputy was patrolling an area of beach near mile marker 263, south of Bob Hall Pier. The area is remote, covered in sand dunes and seagrass. Wildlife is common there: birds, coyotes, the occasional bobcat. The deputy was investigating a cell phone ping in the area, trying to get GPS coordinates, when he noticed something disturbing in the sand. Something that didn't belong. It appeared that animals had been digging in a particular spot, and they had uncovered something terrible. The deputy secured the scene. As darkness fell, he called for backup and equipment. Lights were set up. The area was cordoned off. They would wait until morning to proceed carefully. The next day, October 28th, investigators began excavating the site. They found Michelle Butler's body first, buried in a shallow grave in the sand. Her remains were badly decomposed from the heat and the wildlife activity. Beneath her body, they found James. The couple had been shot to death and buried together on the beach where they had camped. The Clayburgh County Sheriff's Office now had a double homicide on their hands. Lieutenant David Mendoza led the investigative team. The entire department's resources were committed to finding whoever had done this. Investigators worked meticulously. They processed the crime scene. They collected evidence. They reviewed surveillance footage from businesses and border crossings. They interviewed anyone who might have seen the Butlers or their vehicle in the days before they disappeared. And slowly a picture began to emerge. On October 13th, 6 days before the Butlers sent their last text message, a Texas park ranger had conducted a routine traffic stop on Padre Island. The vehicle was a gray Chevrolet pickup truck with Utah license plates. The driver was a man who wasn't wearing his seatbelt. The ranger gave him a warning citation and let him go. The driver's name was Adam Curtis Williams. Williams was 33 years old, originally from Logan, Utah. He had an extensive criminal history. In 2010, he had been arrested after a 3-month drug investigation that turned up 2 pounds of marijuana, over $3,200 in cash, 4 stolen firearms, more than 1,000 hydrocodone pills, and drug paraphernalia. He had served over 8 years in federal prison for weapons and drug distribution charges. He had been released in December of 2018, less than a year before the Butlers disappeared. But his troubles hadn't ended with his release. In April of 2019, Williams had been charged with multiple felonies in Utah, including sexual assault and aggravated assault. He was out on bond, awaiting trial. In June, he had been arrested for domestic violence. In July, he had been convicted of driving under the influence. Adam Williams was a man who should not have been free. On November 1st, the bodies found on Padre Island were positively identified as James and Michelle Butler. On November 4th, the park ranger who had stopped Williams on October 13th saw the surveillance photo of the man driving the Butler's truck across the border into Mexico. He recognized him immediately. It was the same man he had pulled over, Adam Curtis Williams. Investigators also learned that Williams had been traveling with a woman named Amanda Nover. She was 32 years old, also from the Logan, Utah area. She had her own criminal history, though less serious than Williams's. Misdemeanor assault, public intoxication, disorderly conduct. She had a 3-year-old daughter who was with them. On November 5th, authorities released Williams's name and photo to the public, asking for tips about his whereabouts. The next day, November 6th, they got the break they needed. Williams and Nover had fled deep into Mexico. They had driven hundreds of miles south, all the way to the state of Jalisco, over 700 miles from the Texas border. They were attempting to sell the Butler's travel trailer to an RV park owner in the area, but the owner recognized Williams from the news coverage. He had seen the wanted posters. He had seen the surveillance photos. He called the authorities. U.S. Marshals stationed in Guadalajara moved quickly. They worked with Mexican law enforcement to locate and apprehend both Williams and Nover. The arrest was made without incident. Nover's 3-year-old daughter was with them and was safely taken into custody to be returned to family. Williams and Nover were extradited back to the United States. Williams was taken to Houston, then driven to the Clayburgh County Jail in Kingsville, Texas. Nover followed shortly after. On November 8th, both appeared separately in court. They were each charged with felony theft of the Butler's vehicle. Bond for each was set at $1 million. The murder charges would come later. Justice is not always swift. In fact, it rarely is. For more than a year, the Butler family waited while evidence was processed. Texas crime labs, already dealing with enormous backlogs, were further slowed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Staff were reduced. Testing procedures took longer. DNA analysis, ballistics reports, forensic evidence, all of it moved through the system at a pace that must have felt agonizing to those waiting for answers. District Attorney John T. Hubert told reporters in the summer of 2020 that the process simply wasn't as fast as anyone wanted it to be. But the investigation continued, slowly, methodically. On November 5th, 2020, more than a year after the Butlers died, Adam Williams and Amanda Nover were indicted by a grand jury on charges of capital murder. The indictment stated that they had knowingly caused the death of James and Michelle Butler by shooting them with a firearm. Prosecutors made it clear they would seek the death penalty for Williams. Amanda Nover faced the same capital murder charges, though prosecutors indicated they might be willing to negotiate a plea deal in her case. The legal proceedings moved forward, slowly. Court dates were set and postponed. The pandemic continued to delay trials across Texas. Williams and Nover remained in custody, each held on million-dollar bonds. In June of 2021, prosecutors formally announced they would pursue the death penalty against Williams if he was convicted. But Williams and his attorneys were working on an alternative. On November 10th, 2021, Adam Curtis Williams appeared in court and entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder. He pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence related to burying the bodies. He pleaded guilty to unlawful use of a firearm. He pleaded guilty to theft. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His sentences for the other charges, also life sentences for the first-degree felonies of theft and tampering with evidence, plus 20 years for the firearm charge, would run concurrently. He would never leave prison. 3 months later, on February 15th, 2022, Amanda Nover appeared before Judge Jack Polcher via video conference from the Cleburne County Jail. She pleaded guilty to murder, a lesser charge than capital murder. She also pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence, being a felon in possession of a firearm, and theft. As part of her plea agreement, Nover was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She received 10 years for each of the other charges, but because the sentences would run concurrently, she would serve 20 years total. The plea deals meant the full details of what happened to James and Michelle Butler that day in October 2019 would never be fully aired in a public trial, but prosecutors stated that Williams and Nover had shot the couple during what they described as a criminal transaction. The evidence suggested that Williams, desperate and facing serious criminal charges back in Utah, had targeted the Butlers for their vehicle and trailer. He needed a way to flee to Mexico, and James and Michelle had exactly what he needed. It's unclear if the Butlers realized they were in danger. Did Williams approach them under some pretense? Did he pretend to be a fellow traveler in need? We may never know the exact circumstances. What we do know is that sometime between October 16th and October 19th, Williams shot both James and Michelle Butler. With Nover's help, he buried their bodies in a shallow grave on the beach where they had been camping. He took their truck, their trailer, and their belongings, including a lawnmower worth nearly $30,000 that was stored in the trailer. On October 21st, Williams drove the Butler's truck across the border into Mexico, towing their trailer behind him. Amanda Nover was in the passenger seat. Her 3-year-old daughter was with them. By the time the Butlers' bodies were discovered on October 27th, Williams and Nover were already hundreds of miles into Mexico, attempting to start a new life with stolen property and blood on their hands. In Romney, New Hampshire, the small town where James and Michelle had lived before beginning their journey, the community gathered to mourn. A vigil was held on the town common. Strangers and friends alike came together to remember a couple who had been known for their kindness and generosity. George Bonfilio, who owned the Rumney Village store, remembered how James had come over with his tool belt to help renovate the building when Bonfilio first purchased it. Michelle had been one of the store's first employees. They had worked side by side, always together, always willing to help. They were just great, outgoing people, Bonfilio said. Down in Texas, on Padre Island, another vigil was held near where the Butlers' bodies had been found. Local residents, people who had never met James and Michelle, erected 2 crosses in their memory. They came out to the beach to pay their respects to 2 travelers who had come to enjoy the beauty of the Texas coast and had their lives stolen from them. The Butler family established a GoFundMe campaign to help bring James and Michelle's remains home to New Hampshire and to cover the costs of memorial services. The response was overwhelming. People from across the country contributed, moved by the tragedy and wanting to help in some small way. James's sister, Deborah Van Loon, spoke to reporters multiple times during the investigation and trial. Her grief was evident, but so was her determination to see justice done. I hope to find out what they did, why they did what they did, she said. And if it was them, I want them to pay for what they did. When Williams and Nover were finally captured and charged, Van Loon expressed relief. When they were sentenced, she could finally feel that some measure of justice had been achieved, even though it could never bring her brother and sister-in-law back. The ashes of James and Michelle Butler were returned to New Hampshire in December of 2019. A celebration of life was held in January of 2020, giving family and friends a chance to gather, remember, and begin the long process of healing. The murder of James and Michelle Butler is a story that resonates because it touches on something many of us dream about: freedom, adventure, the open road. The idea of selling everything, packing up and seeing the country, living simply, experiencing life, rather than just passing through it. James and Michelle were living that dream. They weren't wealthy. They worked seasonal jobs to fund their travels. They stayed in touch with their family. They were responsible, careful, loving people who happened to want something more than a conventional life. And they encountered someone who saw them not as people, but as an opportunity. Adam Williams was a career criminal who had been given chance after chance by the justice system. Despite multiple felony convictions, despite charges of sexual assault and domestic violence, despite being on probation and facing new charges, he was free. He was able to travel to Texas. He was able to commit murder. The question that haunts many people who followed this case is simply how. How was someone with Williams's history allowed to be free? How did a park ranger stop him just days before the murder, but find no reason to detain him? How many opportunities were there to prevent this tragedy? Amanda Novara's role remains somewhat ambiguous. Was she an equal participant in the murder, or was she trapped in a relationship with a violent man, and too afraid to refuse his demands? The court records don't give us those answers. What we know is that she was there. She helped bury the bodies. She helped steal the Butler's belongings. She crossed the border with Williams, attempting to escape to a new life in Mexico. Her 20-year sentence reflects a judgment that she bears responsibility, even if not to the same degree as Williams. The RV community was shaken by this case. Millions of Americans live and travel in recreational vehicles, and the sense of community among RVers is strong. People look out for each other. They share camping spots and travel tips. They help strangers with mechanical problems and offer advice about the best routes and destinations. James and Michelle Butler were part of that community. Their deaths served as a stark reminder that evil can find you anywhere, even in the most beautiful and peaceful settings. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about James and Michelle Butler not as victims, but as two people who chose to live fully. They loved each other. They loved their family. They shared their adventures with joy and enthusiasm. Their lives were cut short by violence and greed, but their story is also one of love, courage, and the pursuit of dreams. James spent 21 years serving his country aboard an aircraft carrier. He raised children, he built homes. He met a woman at a dart tournament and fell in love. He decided at 48 years old that there was still so much world to see. Michelle was a grandmother who video called her granddaughter every few days. No matter where she was, she posted photos of sunsets and beaches. She worked alongside her husband, whether it was at an oil rig or helping renovate a small-town store. She was warm, she was kind. They parked their trailer on a beautiful beach on the Gulf of Mexico in October of 2019. The waves rolled in. Seabirds called. The sun set over the water, and they never left. But their memory remains in the hearts of their family, in the vigils held by strangers who were moved by their story, in the two white crosses that stood on that Texas beach, marking the spot where two travelers ended their journey far too soon. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded between two continents, in the quiet suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and the darkest corners of the human heart. But told here, in this gentle space, it becomes something different. A meditation on the mysteries we carry, the secrets we keep, and the truth that eventually surfaces. Our story begins not in Australia, but in India, in the lush green state of Kerala, in a small village called Karavalur near Punalur in Kollam district. Picture a village church, the Bethel Marsalma Church. Sunday mornings filled with hymns, young voices rising together in harmony. Among those voices was a young man named Sam Abraham. Sam had a gift for singing, a warmth in his voice that drew people in. He was gentle, soft-spoken, deeply religious, the kind of person who led the choir not through authority, but through genuine love for the music and the community. In that same choir was a girl named Sophia. She was his neighbor, someone he'd known his entire life. Their families knew each other well. Every Sunday they sang together. Every Sunday their voices blended in the sacred space of that church. Childhood friendship has a particular quality to it. Innocent, uncomplicated. Sophia and Sam grew up side by side, and as often happens with childhood friends, somewhere along the way that friendship transformed into something more. Love bloomed quietly, naturally, the way it does when two people already know each other's rhythms and silences. By the time they reached college in Katayam, Sam and Sophia were in love. Sam spoke to his father first, then Sophia spoke to Sam's parents. It seemed inevitable, natural. Both families approved. Sophia's father was a retired defense officer. Sam's parents, Samuel and Leo Lama, welcomed Sophia like the daughter they never had. She called them Mummy and Papa. She was warm, affectionate, the picture of a devoted daughter-in-law. They married in 2008. Sam was working in Dubai at the time, employed by a money exchange company. Life seemed to be unfolding exactly as it should. But there was something Sam didn't know. Something hidden beneath the surface of this perfect story. Sophia had another connection, another person from college, a man named Arun Kamalasenan from Palaka district, an instrumentation engineer. While Sophia was falling in love with Sam, she was also developing feelings for Arun. Even after marriage, she kept in touch with Arun. The connection never quite severed. Let your breathing deepen. Let your body sink further into rest. In 2013, Sophia's sister Sonia was already living in Melbourne, working as a nurse. She helped Sophia secure a position there. Sophia moved first. Melbourne, a sprawling city on Australia's southeastern coast, a place of opportunity, of new beginnings. Sam joined her later that same year, finding work in Melbourne. They had a son by then, a little boy who was the center of their world. The family settled in Epping, a suburb in Melbourne's north, a 3-bedroom house, a quiet street. They continued what they'd always done. They sang in the choir at a local Meyer Toma church. Devotional songs. Sam's voice, still warm and inviting. Sophia beside him. Life in Melbourne seemed good, but Melbourne held something else. Someone else. In July of 2013, Arun Kamalasenan arrived in Melbourne on a student visa. He came alone. His wife and son remained in India. He claimed to be pursuing studies, but the real reason he came became clear soon enough. He had come for Sophia. They reconnected. The old feelings apparently had never disappeared. They began meeting secretly. While Sam worked, while their son played, Sophia and Arun were building something in the shadows. They kept a diary. They called it the Upward Diary after the word printed on its cheap cover, a $3 notebook that would later become evidence of their secret world. They wrote in it in 3 languages: English, Hindi, Malay, as if multiple languages could somehow keep their secrets safer. Sophia's entries were filled with longing. In January of 2013, she wrote, "We never know why we like someone more than others. Days later, I feel to hug you and comfort you. Then, I'm waiting for you." In February, she wrote in Hindi or Malay, "I wish to sleep in your arms. I want to be yours, but you are not mine." Arun's entries matched her intensity. He wrote, "I am sure that one day she will be mine. It's life or next." He wrote, "She's the best match for me and always." On July 9th, 2013, just 2 days after arriving in Australia, Arun made a digital note, "Met my love for first time in Melbourne after 7 months." The affair had begun in earnest, and with it a darker conversation. Sophia wrote, "Planning is always needed in what we do. An idea without a plan is no more than a dream." She wrote, "You make me do bad things. Why am I so cruel?" By 2015, Sam was beginning to notice changes. Sophia's behavior shifted. She was distant, evasive about where she'd been, who she'd seen. They argued frequently. Sam questioned her. She gave no clear answers. But Sam didn't suspect the full truth. Perhaps he thought Sophia was just spending time with an old college friend. Perhaps he trusted her too much to imagine anything worse. In July of 2015, something happened that should have been a clear warning. Sam was at Lober train station, getting into his car. He didn't notice that someone was already inside, hidden in the footwell, waiting. As Sam settled into the driver's seat, the figure emerged. A man wearing a balaclava, his face completely covered, in his hand a knife. The man lunged at Sam, stabbing wildly. Sam fought back. He managed to partially unmask his attacker. The man fled. When police examined the car, they found cable ties, material scraps, handcuffs. This had been planned. This was meant to be more than a simple robbery. Sam survived. He went to the hospital with injuries to his neck, temple, and cheek. He filed a police report, but he said he didn't recognize the attacker. Did he truly not recognize him, or was he protecting someone? Hoping against hope that his marriage could survive, Sam returned home to recover. Sophia was there, concerned, caring, playing the role of worried wife. Police investigated but found no leads. The case went cold, but Sam knew something now. Something had fundamentally changed. He was afraid. In October of 2015, Sam took his family back to Kerala for a visit, 2 weeks with their families. For Sam's parents, it was a joyful reunion, but Sam seemed troubled. He pulled relatives aside. He said things that haunted them later. To his father, Sam said, "I want to be buried near my grandfather's grave." To his relatives, he said, "Next time I come back here, it will be in a coffin." His family laughed uncomfortably. They thought he was being dramatic. Surely he didn't mean it. Surely he was just stressed about work, about life in a foreign country. On October 11th, 2015, Sam, Sophia, and their son left Kerala. They flew back to Melbourne, back to their house in Epping, back to their life. Sam's parents watched them go. They had no idea they would never see their son alive again. October 13th, 2015. Evening in Epping. The family was home. Their son, now 6 years old, was there. Sam, Sophia, and the boy had dinner together. Sophia made an avocado milkshake. She gave it to Sam and their son. She drank one herself. It tasted fine, normal, but Sophia's milkshake was different from theirs. Hers had no sedative. Theirs did. Clonazepam, a powerful medication that induces deep sleep. She had crushed it and mixed it into the drinks. After dinner, the family went to bed, all three of them together in the same bed. Sam in the middle, Sophia on one side, their son on the other. The sedative worked quickly. Sam fell into unconsciousness. His son, too. Sophia, of course, only pretended to sleep. Somewhere in the house, hidden, waiting, was Arun Kamalasanan. He had entered earlier, perhaps through a window in the garage. He had drawn detailed sketches of the house layout beforehand. He knew exactly where to hide, exactly when to emerge. Sophia had given him the signal. The family was asleep. Arun crept into the bedroom. He carried with him a glass of orange juice. But this was not ordinary juice. Dissolved in it was cyanide, a lethal dose. Sam lay unconscious, defenseless, his mouth slightly open as he breathed. His 6-year-old son slept beside him, innocent and unaware. Arun poured the poison juice into Sam's mouth, slowly, bit by bit. The human body has a swallowing reflex even in sleep. When liquid enters the throat, we swallow automatically. Arun knew this. He poured carefully, ensuring Sam's body swallowed the poison without choking, without gasping, without making a sound that might wake anyone. The cyanide entered Sam's system. Sophia lay beside her dying husband. Awake, aware, waiting. Cyanide is a horrific poison. It prevents cells from using oxygen. The victim essentially suffocates from the inside. It's agonizing. Sam's body began to convulse. Foam formed at his mouth. His temperature dropped. his jaw clenched tight in a rictus of pain. And through it all, Sophia waited. Their son continued to sleep, sedated and oblivious. When it was over, Arun slipped out of the house the same way he'd entered. He disappeared into the Melbourne night. Sophia waited a bit longer. Then, at 9:14 in the morning, on October 14th, she placed a call to emergency services. "My husband," she said, her voice shaking. "He's passed out. He's foaming at the mouth." Paramedics arrived at 9:27. They found Sam Abraham in bed, cold, stiff, foam around his mouth, his jaw locked shut. They attempted CPR. They tried everything, but Sam had been dead for hours. Sophia screamed. She called her sister Sonia, who rushed over. She called a friend. She wept. She held their son, who was waking up now, confused and frightened. The paramedics saw no obvious signs of foul play. A young man, 33 years old, apparently dead of sudden cardiac arrest. Tragic. But it happened. Sam was declared dead. The initial assumption was a heart attack. Sophia played her role perfectly. She called Sam's parents in Kerala, her voice breaking with grief. She called relatives. Everyone offered condolences. Everyone rushed to comfort her. 3 days later, on October 15th, Sam's body was prepared for transport. Sophia wanted him buried in Kerala, she said, at home where he belonged. His parents agreed, grateful that their son would rest in familiar soil. On October 18th, Sam Abraham's body arrived in Kerala. The funeral was held. He was buried behind his family home, near his grandfather's grave, exactly where he'd asked to be laid to rest. Sophia stood at the funeral, dressed in mourning clothes, tears streaming down her face. She hugged Sam's parents. She comforted their son. She was the picture of a devastated widow. The community rallied around her. The Malayali diaspora in Melbourne even raised about 30,000 Australian dollars to help the grieving family. Everyone believed Sophia was a victim of cruel fate. A young widow with a small child, trying to navigate an impossible loss. After the funeral, Sophia returned to Melbourne with her son. She moved to a different apartment in the same area. She continued to call Sam's parents every Saturday, her voice still heavy with grief. They talked about their grandson. They tried to comfort each other, but something was happening behind the scenes. Something Sophia didn't know about. Dr. Michael Burke of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine performed the autopsy on Sam Abraham. He was thorough, methodical, and what he found didn't match the story of a heart attack. Sam's stomach contents showed something unexpected. Cyanide, a significant amount, in his blood, in his liver. The cause of death was clear. Cyanide poisoning. There was also something else. Traces of a sedative in his system. Clonazepam. Dr. Burke documented everything. Sent his report to Victoria Police, and the police made a decision. A crucial strategic decision. They didn't tell Sophia. They didn't reveal what they'd found. They let her believe she'd gotten away with it. They let her think Sam's death would remain classified as natural causes. And then they watched. They obtained warrants. They began monitoring Sophia's phone calls. They followed her. 6 surveillance officers were assigned to track her movements. For months they watched, and slowly Sophia's mask began to slip. At first Sophia was careful. She maintained the grieving widow act. But as weeks passed, as no one questioned Sam's death, as the police seemed satisfied with the heart attack explanation, she grew bolder. She began meeting Arun, openly now. They went to lunch together in the CBD. They shopped for groceries. They ran errands like a normal couple. The surveillance officers photographed everything. In January of 2014, police discovered Sophia and Arun had opened a joint bank account at Melbourne Commonwealth Bank. They were pooling their money, planning a future together. Sophia transferred Sam's car registration into Arun's name. She used Arun's address when sending money back to Kerala. The police recorded their phone calls, over 6,000 conversations, 100 hours of audio. They had translators convert the Malayalam conversations to English. The diary was recovered. The upward diary with its passionate, incriminating entries. And then police did something brilliant. They sent in an undercover officer, someone to befriend Arun, to gain his confidence, to get him talking. It worked. In a recorded conversation, Arun spoke freely. "I took that guy off," he said. "I went there with the powder, sleeping pills, and I gave it." He described hiding in the house, drugging the entire family, including Sophia and the child, waiting until everyone was unconscious, then forcing the cyanide-laced juice into Sam's mouth. He said he'd planned it all, that Sophia hadn't known, that he'd done it to free her, but the evidence told a different story. Sophia's diary entries, her planning notes. Planning is always needed in what we do. The joint bank account, the car transfer, the way she'd lied about Sam's cause of death, the way she'd brought his body back to Kerala and buried him quickly, before too many questions could be asked. On August 12, 2016, nearly 10 months after Sam's death, police made their move. Sophia and Arun were arrested. When the remand order was read in court, they stood expressionless. Sophia dressed neatly, her shoulder-length dark hair down, a large necklace around her neck. At one point, she put her face in her hands. Her family sat in the courtroom, visibly distressed. Arun stood in silence, processing what was happening. The investigation was complete. Now came the trial. The trial began in January of 2018. A 14-member jury heard the case. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, the diary entries, the phone records, the surveillance footage, the joint bank account, the car transfer, the undercover recording, the autopsy results, the cyanide, the sedative, the sketch Arun had drawn of Sam's house, showing exactly where he'd hide, exactly where he'd wait, the previous attack at Lalore train station, 3 months before the murder, the balaclava, the knife, the cable ties and handcuffs found in Sam's car. Police now had evidence that Arun had been the attacker that day too. The first attempt had failed, so they tried again. Dr. Burke testified about the involuntary swallowing reflex, how liquid poured into a sleeping person's throat will cause them to swallow automatically, how this explained the cyanide in Sam's stomach. The defense attorneys tried. Sophia's lawyer argued it was impossible for her to let her husband die with their child sleeping right beside them. Arun's lawyer pointed out that his fingerprints weren't found at the crime scene, but the evidence was overwhelming. On March 21st, 2018, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. Both of them. Murder. Sophia asked for leniency because of her young son. The prosecution responded coldly. She showed no thoughts for the child who woke up to find his father dead beside him. Arun's lawyer produced medical documents claiming mental illness. Arun's elderly parents, his wife, his child, all wrote letters pleading for mercy. The court was unmoved. On June 21st, 2018, Justice Paul Coughlin delivered the sentences in the Victorian Supreme Court. Sophia and Arun sat meters apart in the packed courtroom. They said nothing as Justice Coughlin spoke. To Arun, the judge said, "I am satisfied from the evidence that you are the architect and driving force of the murder of Sam Abraham. I am satisfied that your conduct was premeditated." He noted that Arun had attempted to fabricate mental illness over 3 years, as part of a plan to escape culpability if caught. He described the murder as probably excruciating for the victim. Arun Kamalasanan was sentenced to 27 years in prison, with a minimum of 23 years before parole eligibility. To Sophia, Justice Coughlin said, "You are the friend and wife of Sam Abraham, and your actions were a fundamental breach of trust and must be strongly denounced by the court." He admitted it was difficult to know conclusively what role she played, but concluded he could not have been murdered without your knowledge and acquiescence. He noted she showed no remorse. She wore black from head to toe during sentencing, her eyes downcast. Sophia Sam was sentenced to 22 years in prison, with a minimum of 18 years before parole eligibility. The following year, in August of 2019, Arun appealed his sentence. The Supreme Court of Victoria found it disproportionate compared to Sophia's sentence. The court recognized Sophia as a full and willing participant who played an equal role. Arun's sentence was reduced to 24 years, with parole eligibility after 20 years. Their convictions, however, stood. The appeals against the guilty verdicts were denied. Arun won't be eligible for parole until at least 2041. Sam and Sophia's son was 7 years old when his mother was sentenced. He now lives with Sophia's sister Sonia and her husband in Melbourne. Sophia's parents are also in Melbourne, but Sam's parents, Samuel and Leah Lama, want custody of their grandson. They fear for his safety with Sophia's family. Samuel told reporters, "It is not safe to keep him there with that family. How can you keep him with the family of the person who murdered his father? They worry about what will happen as the boy grows older, as he understands what his mother did." They've contacted the Indian External Affairs Ministry. They video chat with their grandson once a month. But Samuel says the boy doesn't speak much, surrounded as he is by Sophia's family. Samuel told reporters he believes Sophia's mother knew everything, that the family is convinced Sophia and Aaron are innocent, that the case was fabricated. The case attracted massive media attention across India and Australia. The Malaya community was shocked. The betrayal felt personal. Everyone had known the family. Many had contributed to the fundraiser for Sophia after Sam's death, only to learn later they'd been supporting a murderer. Sam's parents still remember Sophia as the girl who called them Mommy and Papa, the girl who sang in the choir beside their son, the girl they welcomed as a daughter. "We knew this girl right from childhood," Samuel said. "She was loving and polite. She used to call us regularly until a few days before she was arrested." The disbelief remains. How could the girl they raised as a daughter commit such a betrayal? And Sam's final words haunt them. "Next time I come back here, it will be in a coffin." He knew. Somehow he knew. But he couldn't save himself. And so ends the story of Sam Abraham, a man who loved to sing, who led his church choir with warmth and gentleness, who trusted the woman he'd known since childhood, who forgave her once when he discovered her affair, hoping their marriage could be saved. A man who died in his own bed, poisoned by his wife and her lover, with his 6-year-old son sleeping beside him. The case reminds us that the most dangerous betrayals come from those we trust most deeply. That evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like the neighbor we grew up with, the voice singing beside us in the choir. But it also reminds us that the truth has a way of surfacing, that justice, though slow, can eventually arrive. Sam Abraham was 33 years old when he died. His son is now a teenager, growing up without his father, without his mother, caught between two families forever divided by an unforgivable act. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let this story remind you of the precious nature of trust, of the weight of our choices, of the echoes our actions create, rippling forward through time, touching lives we may never see. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.